My guest today is Tracy Winters. Since 2016, she's been the director of individual insurance at Good Neighbor Insurance, an Arizona based health insurance brokerage firm founded in 1997 that specializes in health insurance advisory and consulting for nomadic travelers, long term travelers, expats, and traveling early retirees. I learned about Tracy and Good Neighbor Insurance from an active Facebook group on nomadic early retirement that I'm a member of. And I asked a question in that group about how other early retirees, particularly long-term traveling early retirees, deal with health insurance because, getting good, affordable health coverage is a real challenge for Americans in particular, because in America, health insurance tends to be tied to your job. And if you don't have a job anymore because you're early retired, then you probably don't have employer-sponsored health insurance. So what do you do for health care coverage as an early retiree, especially if you've got a long way to go before you're covered under Medicare, which itself does not cover you much if you're internationally nomadic. Anyway, most other industrialized countries don't have to deal with this problem because they have national health insurance schemes or a single payer system or some other way that's not tied to an employer. But if you're an American, like I am, like a lot of listeners I'm sure are, then you have to solve healthcare in order to have peace of mind and actually enjoy early retirement. So when I got recommended to Tracy, I reached out to her to see if she could share any tips and advice for Hack Your Wealth podcast listeners about how to think about health insurance coverage as a traveling early retiree. So I'm really glad I was able to get her on the show to share her insights on this. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So I guess I just wanted to first start by understanding, what exactly is the nature of your role at Good Neighbor Insurance?
What I do here is I work with individuals, either individual people or families, to help them find either short-term or long-term plans for their international needs. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a U.S. citizen going out. It could be for anybody from any country. And there's so many different needs as far as budget or why you're going, where you're going. And since Good Neighbor Insurance is a brokerage, we work with quite a few different insurance companies. So we're able to kind of tailor our recommendations to what each person or family needs. We also have an employer group department like what you're used to in the US if you work for a large company and you have employer group coverage. So, and that's for US based companies that work overseas that have employees overseas. So, but that's a different department. I usually just help like the individual families.
Okay, excellent. I'd love to get a little bit more insight in terms of like, how did you, like personally, how did you get into health insurance advisory work? And for listeners on the podcast who are, interested in this topic and, they know that how important the topic of health insurance is, why might listeners want to pay attention to what you have to say about health insurance coverage for long-term traveling early retirees?
Um, it's really about financial protection. So no, the way I got into it, I kind of fell into it. I did a lot of admin work. I actually worked in hotels for 16 years, so I was used to travelers and what they need there. But about 10 years ago, I decided hotel work was not really my forte. Hotel management was not my forte. So I found Good Neighbor Insurance. Just I was just looking for something new. They didn't require a lot of insurance background, which was fine, but got to working with people traveling all over the U.S., especially for like humanitarianism, social good, people going overseas to adopt children, and just those who want to visit other cultures. And the more I talk to people, it's exciting, and someday I can't wait to retire and travel the globe too. But it really has been so great to work with a company like Good Neighbor, just because I do feel like I'm helping, and we do help find like the best fit for especially those that maybe have pre-existing conditions that can't get covered other ways. We can at least if we can't help, we know which way to go for each one of our clients.
Okay,
So.
excellent. So maybe to just frame the discussion to help listeners kind of get into the right headspace, what is the mindset or like maybe the mental framework for how a potential nomadic retiree should think about health insurance coverage. Like, for example, one philosophy might be to just buy enough insurance coverage to prevent a surprise medical bill from bankrupting you or forcing you to go back into the workforce. So maybe that means very limited coverage or really high deductibles, whatever the case may be. But curious if you have any like framework or right mindset that you think a potential nomadic retiree should have as they think about their post-retirement health insurance options.
There's a lot of different ways to begin the discussion when you first start planning your trip overseas or your trip, your move, or your journey. So what we'll want to know from a client first and is what is your current or past medical history? If you have a lot of different pre-existing conditions or something recent, and you're going over long term, expat insurance plans, the long-term renewable plans, require medical underwriting. So the coverage isn't automatically accepted. So we need to know what needs to be covered, or we need to know up front, like, are you going to be covered? So plans that may cover a pre-existing condition would have a higher premium. So that's something to keep in mind if we have clients that have diabetes that need regular like insulin, which could be expensive in the US, but maybe not in other countries. So that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to start your budget. And that's another thing that we want to know up front, like, do you have a budget? Like, is there some frame of your finances that you want to set aside just for the premium? And if you do want a high deductible, that's great. Some of our plans go even up to 25,000. All plans go up to, the long-term plans go up to 5,000 deductible. Some offer the 10,000, 25,000. Another thing that we'll need to know up front is, do you want coverage in the US? So this is advisable if you do, if something happens and you do get more serious illness, do you want to be able to come back to the US? So those are things to just the frame of it.
I see. You mentioned a moment ago that all the long-term plans have a deductible that 5,000 can be higher, maybe 10,000. So did you mean that those are the lowest deductibles, or are those like more like the upper bound?
So you'll have, for all of our plans, there will be deductible options. Some of our long-term plans will go as low as $250 deductible for a year. But whereas you can have a $5,000 deductible, and typically it's per person, not a family deductible. So if you want a $5,000 deductible per person, there's that option. There's just, there's going to be many options when you get quotes for coverage.
Interesting. So, and though, so it sounds like you can sort of probably, I'm sure, pay more premium to get a lower deductible. And did I also
Yes.
hear correctly that the option to get care in the US is not like automatic, it's like an add-on? Is that the right way to think about it?
It's a choice. So you can choose on most plans to exclude coverage in the US, which would bring your premiums down significantly. But yeah, it is an option for the international long-term plans.
Okay. And you mentioned medical underwriting, all the international plans. I think I heard you say require medical underwriting.
Yes.
Can you, share any insight on what does that entail and what are they looking for?
So they're looking to keep their risk level low. So for those that have, um, like the example before, for those that have a condition like diabetes, then we're limited on which companies will accept that person. So they're going to look at that individual person. How much are how much are they going to look at claims for this person if they take this risk on? Well, we have to charge a little bit more in premium to cover this pre-existing condition. Another one that's pretty common is those that are on like high blood pressure medication. A lot of the low cost budget plans are going to have or can offer coverage but may exclude cardiac, which means anything to do with high blood pressure, heart, anything, you can get your insurance, but it's not going to cover that. So if you want something to cover that pre-existing condition, the insurance companies, the underwriters are going to take a look. What's your actual risk? Like, what's your dosage? Have you had a heart attack in the past, or are you just, is it, so they want to look at your medical history a little bit closer if you are on kind of like a maintenance medication. So essentially underwriting is just the insurance company evaluating their risk in covering a person with pre-existing conditions.
So fair to say that, your chronic conditions are probably going to have less options. Maybe if you had an acute condition some time ago, but is no longer there, less concerning.
Yes, that's correct. So if you were on high blood pressure medication and, through diet and exercise got off of it 2 years ago, you may not have any exclusions going forward. So it's really a case by case basis. And the more you tell us within limits, because we still want to stay HIPAA compliant, where we share what is relevant, but we don't want to we don't share any medical history unless you give us permission to go to the insurance company on your behalf.
I see. It's a requirement though, right? So I guess if you don't share it, then they will just say, sorry, we're not going to cover you.
So, well, to apply for an insurance coverage, you do have to supply your medical history. So if you don't supply provide your medical history, or you don't disclose certain condition or any condition, you can. They can actually cancel your coverage if they found that you were, essentially fraudulent on an application. So applications are completely confidential between a client and the insurance company, and they're not shared with anyone else.
Do they do so like I remember when I did, I think it was like life insurance, somebody came and took my blood and like had me do a urine test. Is there any of that stuff involved, or is it just a questionnaire?
It's just a questionnaire for the most part. We have one insurance company that if you're over the age of 55, they're going to want to see your last blood test. They want to know that you've had a physical in the last 6 months. So, but most other plans will not ask for any other kind of medical records.
Okay,
And nobody will
gotcha.
come to your house.
Okay, gotcha. So a lot of countries outside the US have quite good quality health insurance
Hmm.
for or rather health care provider service. Like you have the good quality care for very affordable prices. And so sometimes a legit strategy might be to just plan to pay out of pocket for most routine or even most non-emergency care, because again, a lot of countries outside the US have pretty good healthcare for affordable prices. So curious if you have any thoughts about when it might make sense for a traveling retiree or an early retiree to simply say, you know what, I'll self-insure, I'll just pay out of pocket if I need care, and I won't bother with paying for health insurance. Like, are there circumstances where you might advise that as a good viable strategy?
That's a good time to really research the country that you're going to stay in for a significant amount of time. So because country by country, even hospital by hospital, it's a very fluid. It can change all the time. So whereas maybe like a few years ago we had a client in Kenya in a motorcycle accident, and she had 2 or 3 surgeries and only paid $600 out of pocket. And then I know Italy right now is very open to visitors and tourists. Many hospitals in Italy don't charge or will charge just a small fee for any kind of emergency medical care, but that's also hospital by hospital in Italy. So it's good to do the research on the countries you're going to or maybe staying in for a longer period of time.
I guess on that note, what countries? I know you said hospital by hospital, but maybe there are patterns, at least at the country level. What countries do you think provide good quality care for cheap? Because, sometimes the care is cheap, but it's not very good. And other times it's good, but not very cheap. And in some cases, it's both cheap and also good. So curious if you have any insight on, what places in the world or countries in the world have both based on, all the traveling expats you've advised over the years.
From what I've heard recently, countries, especially in Europe, are pretty good right now. Like Spain, Portugal, and Italy are probably the top 3 that have like the best healthcare. Um, uh, Spain and Portugal may not be the cheapest, but yeah, a lot of countries in Europe right now are probably some of the best places to go for healthcare. As far as low cost, that could change daily.
Okay. Um, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about sort of the range or the type of health insurance options that you might recommend for different profiles of travelers. So, I had kind of like four profiles in mind. So on from one end of the spectrum to the other, someone who wants to be abroad like all the time, like 100% of the time, and then the next kind of like rung over would be like maybe somebody who wants to be abroad the vast majority of the time, but they want to come home sometimes. So maybe they're abroad 90% of the time, but they want to come home for like a couple of weeks a year, a few weeks a year for major holidays, for Christmas, things like that. And then moving over to the next rung, maybe somebody who wants to split their time pretty evenly, abroad versus in the US. And then finally, on the other extreme, somebody who wants to spend most of their time in the US and basically just take long vacations, maybe, I don't know, a quarter of the year, 25% of the year. And I'm curious, if there are differences in health insurance options that you would recommend given these type of this range of profiles.
Absolutely. So for somebody who is only going to be outside of the country, outside of the US for only 25% of the time, say 3 or 4 months, it's best to stay on your US health insurance on an ACA compliant plan, and then just use like short-term travel insurance. And we've got a myriad amount of short-term travel options. And that'll just cover like new injuries, new illnesses, and medical evacuation while you're outside of the country. And you can get that per trip. You can actually we have multi trip. So if you go for a month here, come back, and a month there, and then come back, like a annual multi trip's usually a lot more cost effective.
Mm.
All of our long term expat plans that are renewable have up to 6 months of US coverage. So if you are going to be outside of the US for at least 6 months out of the year, that's when you are going to be eligible to be on a long-term expat plan. So where you're only going to be 6 months, that's when you definitely want to have that US coverage, like we talked about before. So you do want to add that US coverage that way, because usually international health insurance plans are going to be lower cost than like a US domestic individual ACA compliant plan.
Mm.
So And then when you get into 90% or 100% outside of the US every year, that's where you want to consider maybe excluding the US if you know that's where you're going to be, especially for, 2, 5, 10 years. That's definitely your goal, is to be outside of the US. Um, we do have short-term travel plans back to the US. So if you know you're only going to be back for a couple weeks at a time, you can do a travel plan back to the US if your international plan excludes the US. Just keep in mind that if you get a short-term travel plan back to the US, it's only going to cover you for emergencies while you're back. So you can't come back to the US to seek treatment. But it is something to keep the cost down if you're going to be outside of the US 100%, 90% of the time. It's just have like an as needed backup plan for US coverage, just for trips back home for Christmas time, Thanksgiving.
I see. But those would only be for like if you got hit by a motorcycle and not if you, I don't know, discovered a tumor or something like that, right?
Correct, correct. So it would be any new injuries, new illnesses. So if you came back to the US and got COVID while you were back in the US, it would cover, like, these short-term travel plans would cover you if you needed treatment for COVID, or if you had like food poisoning or broke a leg, broken arm. It's just any new injury, new illness. But if you did come back and find a tumor, that's when you want to, uh, you know, um, go outside of the US if your coverage is outside of the US, and especially if you're in a country like Spain that has amazing healthcare. You can go back to Spain, you can go back to the UK, or whichever country you had come from. And I know, like, Singapore has incredible healthcare coverage. So I mean, there's plenty of places that you can get treatment. But if you do come back to the US, something like that happens, you find it, you'll likely, and if you do want to stay in the US for treatment, you'll have to get on a US domestic insurance plan. So, and US domestic insurance plans will cover pre-existing conditions from day one. So if you want to stay back in the US for treatment, that's what you would have to do if you excluded US from your expat plan.
Right. I see. The ones I forgot, but the ones that is it the case that for if you did find yourself in that unfortunate situation and you're like, I need to switch back to a US plan, US plans cannot exclude pre-existing conditions if they're ACA plans, or just all of them, just all plans now cannot.
If it's an ACA compliant plan or Obamacare plan, they cannot exclude pre-existing conditions.
Okay. Um and you mentioned, I think that you mentioned that the long term, like if you're spending vast majority of your time abroad or even all of your time abroad, the long term international health plans tend to be a lot cheaper. I was wondering if you could comment why that is. Is that just because the cost of care is lower in other countries?
Yes, for most countries. So I do have one plan that's going to exclude countries like Singapore and China and Taiwan, just because they have their medical costs are so much higher. They're comparable to costs in the US. So, but most plans, as long as you exclude the US, it's just the US and Canada sometimes. But yeah, it's just because the cost in the US is so much higher.
I see. So does the premium amount depend on where you're going, such that you actually have to stay in those countries? Like you can't just be truly nomadic, or are they more plans that cover everywhere, maybe with a few country exclusions? What's the right way to think about that?
So when you apply for a long-term coverage, you do have to have a destination in mind. So even if it's a temporary destination, even if you're going to maybe just going to be in New Zealand for a couple weeks and you have an Airbnb address, you do have to have that. And some plans do base their rates on what country you're going to. But for the most part, once you're started, you can be anywhere in the world. So unless you're back in the US, that's the only time that's an issue, or that the insurance company needs to know. Once you come back to the US and you plan on staying in the US, then you actually wouldn't be eligible for an international plan any longer. But no, you can be truly nomadic. You just have to have a start country.
Then how is that not a totally, I guess, totally hackable? Because if a lot of plans say will exclude something like Singapore or Taiwan or something, and then you have your Airbnb address in New Zealand, you go there for a month. And let's remove, like, I don't know, like, hacking intent, but like, let's say you went there for a month and you're like, you know what, I haven't figured out what my next destination is, but come week 4 rolls around, you're like, Singapore sounds nice, why don't I go there? Even though you would not have been able to buy an insurance plan for Singapore had you started out there. Like, surely insurance companies know that. How is that, I guess, allowed if you can be truly nomadic?
So unless the country is actually excluded, like the one plan that we have that does exclude, like if you exclude the US, you exclude Singapore, you exclude China. So that's the only plan that if you do decide to go to Singapore, you're just not going to have coverage. So with the insurance companies, they will it's worldwide coverage, unless you exclude the US. It's going to be worldwide no matter where you go. So it's not really it's not an issue whatsoever. You can be anywhere in the world. They're just going to base the rate on the address that you provide. So a lot of people use a friend or family members that's maybe based in Spain, and that's completely fine. Every insurance company is and we've double checked, because that's what we do as a brokerage. We double check and make sure everything is copacetic with the insurance companies. But they've all confirmed, nope, as long as you have an address outside of the US, you can be anywhere in the US and have coverage, as long as that country is not excluded from the start.
I see. So, and I think what I understood is that it's not really hackable, because the plan will just specify in the terms which countries are excluded, and if it's just written out that it's excluded, you just can't go there and be covered. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay, I gotcha. I was also curious. So how does the claims process work, in that, globally there could be millions and millions of providers. There's no way that the insurance company has relationships with everybody in the world, especially one that's global. So is the patient meant to always just pay out of pocket first and then try to get a reimbursement later? Or are there direct relationships with some providers and not others? Like, how does that work?
That is a great question. For the most part, if it's something minor, say under $1,000, like it's a medical treatment, it's under $1,000, most most international insurance companies will want you to pay out of pocket. So, and then submit a claim for reimbursement, of course, less whatever your deductible is. Um, if it's anything emergent or is something major, you have to have surgery, you have to be hospitalized overnight. And it looks like your medical bills could be quite high, over $1,000. You call you or a family member, or even a staff at the hospital, they get in contact with the 24-hour emergency number for the insurance company. The insurance company can then set up a promise to pay that hospital directly if needed. Most our 3 major insurance companies that we work with actually do have direct billing with quite a few international hospitals. So you have, because we do work with a company like Geo Blue, which is which Blue Cross Blue Shield is what we're used to here in the US, but GeoBlue is very global. We also work with Cigna Global, and those are the top two international insurance companies, and they do have direct billing with major hospitals. But if you go in for an earache, you're just pay out of pocket and submit the claim. And most claims are done digitally, so um, you can do it by email, and a lot of insurance plans have member portals that you would be able to download any documents. So always recommend getting an itemized medical, like a receipt. So it shows line by line what you got the treatment for. If you can get any medical records while you're there, because if you're traveling, especially if you're nomadic, it'd be hard to try to go back if you're already in the next country that you're planning on going to try to get medical records after the fact. So you just make sure you got everything. But yes, when in doubt, call the 24-hour insurance emergency number.
I see. So to ask them, like, if I want to get this surgery done, let's say, can I set up a direct billing? Like, call them to ask that type of question.
Yeah, so you can actually pre-certify. So, and then when usually, and pre-certification is really just to for the insurance company to know that it's medically necessary, that you're not just going in for some kind of elective surgery. So you don't have to pre-certify with every single company, but if you know if you're scheduled to have surgery, it is best to have that set up. You can have the insurance company contact the hospital directly. They can work that out prior to. And some companies will also, provide a letter, like a letter, this is covered. But yeah, the insurance company will work that out.
How can the patient know in advance, like which hospitals have that relationship? Because I can imagine, like, let's say you're traveling in the UK and there's not, I think not all the hospitals have like billing departments even. And there's like, where's your NHS card? And, like, what are you talking about billing? Like, is there a website on the insurer's webs? Can patients log into the insurer's website to find like a list by country of all the relationships they have and maybe do some planning that way? Or how does that work?
Yes, most of the companies that we work with have like a provider search. It's not necessarily like a preferred provider search in the US, although it's on there too. So if you're looking for a PPO in the US for a doctor in your city, it's something to that effect. But yes, there are the three major ones: IMG, GeoBlue, and Cigna all have international provider searches, so you can find the hospital that already has a direct billing relationship.
Gotcha. And I think you were alluding to this a moment ago, but is there a concept of like in network versus out of network, or is it just all one?
Outside of the US, it's all one. You can go any hospital, any licensed physician you can go to.
Okay. Um, I was also curious, like, are the insurance companies that issue international policies, are these for the most part American companies, or do they tend to be like companies that have foreign headquarters that are just doing business in the US?
GeoBlue, IMG, and another company that we work with, Azimuth, they are all US based. Cigna Global is actually out of the UK. But yep.
Okay. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about ACA plans, and I was just curious if you have any insight. This might be orthogonal, but I just don't have a good way to think about it. Like, curious, what coverage options do ACA marketplace plans provide if were going to be a nomadic retiree? I'm sure it probably depends a lot on what state you're domiciled in, but are there any general insights you have for listeners on whether they can even utilize an ACA marketplace plan for health insurance as a traveling retiree, and if so, how?
Um, that's kind of where cost is going to come into play. So, and especially if you have a pre-existing condition and you can't get on an international plan. So yeah, it is state by state. And most ACA compliant plans, as long as you're paying the premium, you can keep your coverage even though you're outside of the US for a certain amount of time. And so yeah, so the only time I would recommend it is if you're going to be within the US 6 months or more. You'll want to keep an ACA compliant plan, or if you have pre-existing conditions that you want to come back. But yeah, it is state by state, and you really have to know your costs. And just keep in mind, there are open enrollment is only at the end of the year for January 1st. There are special enrollment periods if you change your address. So if you've been outside of the US for 6 months or more, and you've moved back, as long as it's been within 62 days, or say you've been outside of the US and you've been on a expat plan, and your coverage ends June 1st and you've moved back to the US, well, you're losing your health insurance. So you would be eligible for like a special enrollment period because you've lost your insurance and you need to get back on. So
I see. So, but just to be clear, as a general matter, can ACA plans actually be used for care outside the US, or no? As a
no,
general matter. I see.
no, generally no.
So you would still have to anyway. I think you were saying then you can buy the ACA plan, but probably only worthwhile if you're here at least half of the year, and in the other half, you would just have to buy supplemental.
Correct. And you can have the ACA compliant plan and then just use like the travel medical plans that would cover new injuries, new illnesses while you're outside of the US, and also include the medical evacuation. And we
Okay.
do have medical evacuation only plans. So if that's something where you just want to go and want to make sure that you can be evacuated directly back to the US to your hospital of choice, we can help with that too.
I see. Okay. Medicare. So for seniors who are already on Medicare, how should they think about Medicare coverage if they also want to be nomadic or at least long-term traveling? And in what ways is your Medicare coverage impacted by, spending large portions of your time abroad?
So Part A and Part B, which are the ones that you automatically want to enroll in when you turn 65, those are not affected at all. So if you're outside of the US, nothing is affected by that because those are federal. You don't have to stay. If you do have Part C, which would cover anything that Part A and Part B, Part A is hospitalization, Part B is like your outpatient, your labs and things like that. Part C covers everything else. The Part C is state by state. So if you do have Part C and your home state finds out that you've been outside your state for 3-6 months at a time, that's when they can cancel that. And so that's really the only Medicare part that would really be affected if you're outside of the US for an extended period of time. But if you do plan on keeping Part A and B, you can, maybe just do the emergency coverage or just a medical evacuation coverage, which we do have quite a few of our clients that have opted for that, to just have a medical evacuation coverage so they can come back to the US and get treated here in the US where their Medicare is going to take care of them. There is a plan under Part C if they're just traveling and they're not going to be affected by being outside of the US because they're only traveling short term. There is a plan that you can choose that covers international travel. But this plan that does cover the international travel on Medicare only covers up to $50,000 lifetime, has a 20% coinsurance and a $250 deductible, which means it's really one and done. So if you choose to get that plan under Part C for the international, and you go to the Caribbean on a cruise and you have to go to the hospital because you have to have surgery on a leg, it's really That's all you're ever going to use. And now you're out of pocket $10,000 because of that, because you have that deductible. But we have short-term travel plans that can kind of compensate, like to be a little bit additional coverage for those short-term, especially for seniors.
I see. So I guess for part C, then is basic strategy. If I know I'm going to say spend 3/4 of my year abroad, to just not buy a normal part C supplement and instead do part A, part B, and then just, go to you, for example, and buy an international plan. And that's the extent of it.
That would be advisable. So because there's no this is really not in my wheelhouse. So like Medicare.gov is really the best best website. It's a really good website for a government website to get more information on this. But yeah, part A, part B, and also part D are not affected, and you can keep that coverage. And then if you want something supplemental while you're outside of the US, we can do that's when you want to get the expat plans or a travel plan that doesn't cover the US, so you're not paying the additional premium.
I see. So like if I was, my first year of Medicare, let's say, and I'm like, go, go, go. I want to travel. And, I buy international insurance from like to cover my part C part, I guess.
Hmm.
And then after a few years, I'm like, you know what? I'm tired. I'm ready to plunk down and, just play golf all day in my home state. Then I could still do open enrollment and get a normal part C plan, I think, right?
I believe so, but I'm not the best person to
Okay.
ask that.
No, no worries, no worries.
So, but yeah, I think you'd have to check within your home state to see like what's available for Part C.
Can I ever use my part A and B abroad, or is that only if I'm inside of the US?
Only inside the US.
I see. Interesting. So it's not affected, but it also doesn't do me much good outside.
Correct, correct. You still have to pay for Part B or Part D while you're outside of the US, but it's not affected. You keep it forever as long as you're paying for Part A is automatic, and there's no charge for the Part A. It's already paid for, but Part B and Part D for D is the prescriptions. There is that additional that charge that you have to pay.
Okay. I wanted to talk a bit about repatriation. How should folks think about like when it's worthwhile to repatriate back to the US to get medical care versus staying, in country and getting it abroad?
It really will depend on the situation. So, and repatriation, evacuation, is something that's very, very important, for good, our brokerage here, Good Neighbor, that every single policy that we have includes evacuation and repatriation. So, now with evacuation, um, this is covered when it's a life-threatening or life or limb-threatening situation. You're in the hospital, maybe you're in an area that doesn't have the best coverage. Maybe you're in Luxembourg and they want to take you to France. So that's when the insurance company in the hospital will work on getting you across borders to get you the best and nearest hospital for treatment. And most evacuations are always going to take you there. So if you do have to have a medical evacuation, every single one of our insurance plans, once you're released from that hospital that you were evacuated to, you will then have the choice to either go back home to the US if you want to keep recovering in the US, or you can go back to where you were evacuated from. If it's something that's maybe not immediately life-threatening, but if you do get an unfortunate diagnosis and do want to come back to the US for treatment, that would be your own responsibility to go home. If you did want to repatriate, and a lot of times people do want to have that emotional support of family and friends here in the US. So that's when you want to come back to the US. But again, that would be your own responsibility if it's not a life or limb threatening situation.
I want to circle back to life or limb in a moment, but are evac and repatriation different benefits, or are they one and the same in the eyes of insurance companies?
They are different benefits. The evacuation is going to be when you're in a hospital that is not going to give you the care that you need, or they're not able to provide the care that you need. I like to compare it often if you're in a car accident here in the US and say you're a block away from a hospital, but that hospital doesn't have a trauma center. The ambulance isn't going to take you to that hospital because it's not going to be the best one. So, or maybe they take you there just to get you stable, but then they're going to transport you to the hospital that's going to be the best for you. So it's kind of how that's how evacuation will work. If you're in a hospital that does not have the services that you need, that's when the insurance company and the hospital are going to work together to say, yes, we're going to get you evacuated. Most medical evacuations can take place within 24 to 48 hours. They will get you to where you need to go. Repatriation is usually after the fact. So if you're medically evacuated, and you got the treatment and the hospital is going to take care of you, then the repatriation, sometimes it's included in the evacuation coverage, but sometimes it's a different benefit. Just depends on the plan. But either way, it's going to be covered. The repatriation is covered. The policy wording is going to be a little bit different plan to plan, but it's always going to be included.
I see. Is sorry, is the simpleton way to think about repatriation basically then that, once you're stable, we'll buy you an airplane ticket home? Is that the right?
That's correct. Mhm.
So if you were really life or limb and you then you actually make use of the repatriation benefit, and you were like you only had long-term international insurance because you were, say, living abroad most of the year, they drop you off on the doorstep in the US, but you don't have health insurance coverage here. So what happens next?
So so if you've chosen not to have the US coverage, then that's when you'll have to get on an ACA compliant plan just as quickly as you can. And that's also why the insurance companies give you the choice to go back to where you came from. So if you were in Luxembourg and went to France, they say, do you want to go back to the US or do you want to go back to where you are? That's why they give you the choice.
I see. Okay, and then you mentioned, life or limb conditions. What are that may sound like it's very obvious, but I can kind of squint my eyes and think of maybe some scenarios where it's maybe not so obvious. So I was curious if you could shed some more light on what qualifies and what doesn't.
So, a lot of times it's case by case. I know we had a client that was in um I believe South Africa, and the insurance company decided that they wanted to bring them back to the US. But it was like it was a I think like a back injury. So it was a spinal injury. So they did evacuate that person back to the US. So not, it was maybe not necessarily life threatening, but it's really going to, like, this is, if it's urgent and very serious medical care, they're going to do the evacuation. So, but we've also had people that maybe broke their leg, and they just, and they could have lost their leg if they didn't get the correct surgery, the correct orthopedic surgery. And then they'll get evacuated to the nearest and best hospital that would cover that surgery. So it's really going to be a case by case basis, and the insurance company will work directly with the with the hospital to make sure that that person's getting the care they need.
I see. Interesting. Um, sorry, this may sound really naive, or I don't mean to be melodramatic, but you have to, I guess, be conscious to make the evacuation election, right? Like if you were hit in a car crash and now you're in a coma, then you're just up to the good Samaritan graces of whoever found you. Is that? I think that's probably right, right?
To a point. Just like the pre-certification, the emergency contact. Somebody from the hospital can call the insurance company as long as they have your information. Or if if you're a couple and it's your husband, then you can the wife can call on the husband's behalf. No, you don't have to do that yourself. As long as the hospital has the insurance company's information, and then they can take care of that for you.
Okay, gotcha. And then lastly, you said that all the plans that you guys offer in your brokerage have evac and repatriation. Is it generally included in just most expat long-term traveler health insurance plans full stop? Or just the ones that you guys work with happen to have all have it, but if you go to the broader marketplace, it might be hit or miss. Which of the two is it?
I think for the most part, a lot of them are going to include it now. I believe a Cigna is the only one that's optional that we work with. So you can choose to not have it. If we quote Cigna, we are always going to quote it with the medical evacuation coverage.
Okay, gotcha. Tracy, I think that's all I have. Where can people find out more about you and your work and services?
So if you look at Good Neighbor Insurance, you can email us at info@gninsurance.com. We're here Monday through Friday. And then info will come to me and also come to my partner in crime, Gabby here. She can answer any of your expat or individual insurance uh, questions that you may have. We're in Gilbert, Arizona. Our phone number is 480-813-9100. And we're here 8 to 4 Arizona time. So if you're listening to this after November, it's going to be mountain time. Right now we're Pacific time.
All righty. Thanks so much, Tracy. Look forward to sharing this out with our listeners. Take care.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andrew. It was fun.